had always prided myself on being independent, both in my career and personal life. Running a successful beauty salon gave me financial freedom, and for years, my main focus had been raising my son Marcus on my own. Our bond was unshakable, built on years of trust, laughter, and unwavering support. From a young age, Marcus had been drawn to horses, and when he turned 21, I knew exactly what to do. I pulled some strings with old friends who owned a prestigious equestrian school and enrolled him in a program where he could refine his passion. Watching his excitement as he threw himself into the lessons with that same intensity he had always had for the things he loved filled me with pride. With Marcus settling into his new world of equestrian training, I decided it was time to focus on my personal life. It had been a long time since I'd been in a serious relationship. I didn't feel an urgent need for romance, but I told myself that maybe it was time to let someone in. That's when Simon came into the picture. Simon was charming in the way men who know their own appeal often are. He was good-looking, successful, and always knew the right thing to say. But something about him never quite clicked for me. He was a safe choice. Someone I could introduce to my friends without hesitation, someone who fit the mold of a partner even if he didn't stir much emotion within me. But I convinced myself that companionship mattered more than passion. A few months into dating Simon, I started noticing a shift in Marcus. He had become distant, our once effortless conversations now strained. I often caught him watching me with an unreadable expression. At first I figured he was just adjusting to his new schedule, but the tension between us only seemed to grow. One evening, after a long day at the salon, I came home to find Marcus waiting for me in the kitchen. He had just returned from the equestrian school, his hair slightly tousled, a faint trace of sweat still on his brow. I smiled as I stepped inside, placing my purse on the counter. "You're home early," I noted. Marcus shrugged, his eyes flickering toward me before settling on the glass of water in his hands. "Yeah. Had some things on my mind." I poured myself a drink, feeling the weight of the silence between us. "Want to talk about it?" For a moment he hesitated. Then with an exhale that sounded almost like a sigh, he set the glass down. "Are you happy with him?" The question caught me off guard. "With Simon?" I frowned. "Why do you ask?" He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "I just don't see it, Mom. You don't light up around him. You don't laugh the way you do when we talk about things that actually excite you." I let out a soft chuckle, shaking my head. "Marcus, relationships aren't always about excitement. Sometimes, it's just about finding someone you can share your life with." His jaw tensed. "That sounds more like settling." Something in his voice, the intensity of his words, made me pause. I studied him for a long moment, sensing there was something deeper beneath his question. "Marcus," I started, choosing my words carefully. "Is there something you're not telling me?" His gaze flickered, uncertainty flashing across his features. Then with a quiet shake of his head, he pushed off the counter. "Forget it. I just want you to be happy." And with that he walked away, leaving me with an unsettling feeling I couldn't quite place. That night as I lay in bed, my thoughts tangled with memories. Of Marcus as a child, of the years of unwavering closeness we had shared, of how he had always been my greatest source of joy. And of the way he had looked at me tonight, as if something unspoken had been hovering between us all along. I didn't know what it was yet, but I knew one thing for certain. Something had changed. The days that followed left me feeling uneasy. I found myself analyzing every interaction with Marcus, wondering if I had missed something. Some shift in our dynamic that had been there all along, quietly simmering beneath the surface. Marcus wasn't himself. He still came home after his lessons, still greeted me with the same warmth he always had, but there was something different in his gaze now. It lingered too long. His laughter, usually so effortless, felt strained, and I noticed how he hesitated before touching my shoulder or brushing past me in the hallway. As if he was afraid to cross an invisible line. One evening, Simon came over for dinner. He arrived with a bottle of wine, pressing a kiss to my cheek as he walked inside. I was setting the table when Marcus entered the kitchen, freshly showered, his hair still damp. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Simon, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You're just in time to eat," I said, glancing at him. I already had something, he replied, his voice tight. He didn't look away from Simon. Simon chuckled. Come on, kid. Sit with us for a bit. Marcus's jaw tensed. I'm not a kid. Simon raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Right. Didn't mean anything by it. I exhaled, sensing the tension mounting between them. Marcus, please. Just stay for a while. For a moment he didn't move. Then slowly he stepped forward and pulled out a chair, settling across from Simon. He barely touched the food on his plate, barely spoke. I did my best to keep the conversation light, but every now and then I caught him watching me, his expression unreadable. It wasn't until later that night, after Simon had left, that I found Marcus sitting alone in the living room, staring at nothing in particular. I hesitated before joining him on the couch. What's going on with you? I asked gently. He was quiet for a long time before finally turning to face me. His eyes, so familiar, so much like the little boy I had raised, held something else now, something I couldn't quite name. You don't love him, Marcus said. His certainty made my breath hitch. Marcus. You don't, he repeated, his voice softer this time. You're with him because you think you should be. Because it's the right thing to do. I swallowed. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. I didn't love Simon. I never really had. He was convenient. Safe. A way to fill the quiet spaces in my life. There was something strange in his voice, something that made my pulse skip a little. He stepped forward finally, closing the space between us, his hands slipping into his pockets. The golden light of the setting sun cast long shadows over the stable, highlighting the sharp lines of his face, the flicker of something in his expression I wasn't ready to name. I liked watching you, he said, his voice lower than usual. You looked free. I swallowed, feeling my grip tighten slightly on the reins. It felt good. Marcus nodded, his gaze flickering over my face before settling on my eyes. His stare felt heavier than before, like he was searching for something. An answer, maybe. Or permission. The silence between us stretched, thick and weighted. The air was cool, but my skin felt too warm. My heartbeat was suddenly too loud in my ears. I stepped back just slightly, clearing my throat. We should get the horses back. Marcus blinked as if snapping out of something. He exhaled and gave a small, almost amused shake of his head. Yeah. Right. But as we led the horses back into their stalls, the energy between us didn't fade. It only thickened. I could feel it in every glance he stole, in the way his fingers brushed mine when we reached for the same buckle. Every small touch sent something electric through me, something I tried to ignore but couldn't. And Marcus, he wasn't hiding it anymore. When we finished, he leaned against the stall door, watching me as I brushed down my horse. His arms were crossed over his chest, but he wasn't trying to look casual. If anything, he looked intense. I swallowed hard, forcing a laugh. You're staring again. He didn't deny it. He just tilted his head slightly. Can I ask you something? I kept my hands busy, running the brush along the mare's sleek coat. Sure. Are you happy? The question stopped me cold. My fingers tightened around the brush, and I forced myself to keep my breathing even. I glanced at him over my shoulder, my smile faltering. That's a loaded question. He shrugged. Maybe. I hesitated, then turned to face him fully. I have a good life, Marcus. I have my business, my independence. I've raised a son I'm proud of. He didn't look satisfied with that answer. And Simon? I inhaled sharply. What about him? Marcus's gaze darkened slightly. Does he make you happy? I looked away. Marcus. You don't love him, he said quietly. A lump formed in my throat. Not all relationships are about love, I said, echoing the words I had told him before. But they sounded even emptier now. Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. You deserve more than that. Something inside me cracked. I didn't want to have this conversation, not here, not now, not with him looking at me like that. We should go, I said, my voice quieter than before. Marcus didn't argue. He just nodded, but the tension in his shoulders never left. The ride home was silent. Marcus drove, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, his jaw clenched. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, pretending not to notice. When we pulled into the driveway, I hesitated before getting out. Marcus sat still for a moment, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. Then suddenly he turned to me. "Come inside for a minute." I frowned. "Marcus, we live together." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah. Right." But there was something in his tone, something unreadable. I followed him inside, locking the door behind me. The house was quiet, the air thick with something unspoken. I set my keys down, turning just as Marcus took a step toward me. I didn't move. His gaze locked onto mine and I felt my breath hitch. "Marcus. I just need to know something," he interrupted, his voice softer now. I swallowed hard, unsure of what he was about to say, unsure if I wanted to hear it. "What?" He hesitated, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then slowly he reached up, fingers grazing my cheek, barely touching, just enough to send a shiver down my spine. I should have stepped away. I should have said something to break whatever was happening. But I didn't. I couldn't. His voice was barely a whisper. "Are you really okay with this?" I didn't know what this meant. The life I had built. The choices I had made. Or the fact that something between us had shifted into dangerous, uncharted territory? I opened my mouth, but no words came out. His fingers trailed down, barely touching my jaw before he let his hand drop. He stepped back, shaking his head as if trying to snap himself out of something. "I'm sorry," he muttered. The days that followed blurred together in a way that made me lose track of time. What had started as an occasional visit to the stables soon became a habit. Each afternoon, I found myself leaving the salon early, my hands tightening on the steering wheel as I drove to the equestrian school. And every time Marcus was waiting for me. At first we kept it simple. But with each ride, the distance between us shrank. The lessons became less about riding and more about us. I found myself laughing more than I had in years, the kind of laughter that left me breathless, that made my heart feel light. Marcus noticed it too. I could tell by the way he looked at me, his eyes lingering a little longer, a quiet warmth in them that made my chest tighten. One afternoon, as the sun stretched golden over the fields, I sat atop one of the more gentle mares, Marcus standing beside me. He watched me carefully, one hand resting on the saddle. "You're getting better," he murmured. "Thanks to my patient teacher." I smiled, feeling a swell of pride. Marcus smirked. "I don't know if I'd call myself patient." I chuckled, shifting in the saddle. "You're better than you think." His gaze darkened slightly, something flickering in his expression. "You really think that?" I nodded. "Of course." His hand lifted, brushing a strand of hair from my cheek before I even had time to react. The touch was fleeting, almost hesitant, but it sent something warm through me, something I wasn't ready to name. I swallowed. "Marcus." He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. "We should head back." And just like that, the moment passed. But the feeling didn't. Every lesson after that became something more. The conversations grew deeper, our laughter came easier, and the space between us became non-existent. I began to look forward to the feeling of his hands adjusting my stance, the way his voice softened when he encouraged me, the way his touch lingered just a second longer than necessary. One evening, after a long ride, we sat together in the barn, the scent of hay thick in the air. The horses were settled in their stalls, the only sound their soft breathing. Marcus leaned back against the wooden wall, stretching his legs out. "I missed this," he admitted. I glanced at him. "Missed what?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Just spending time with you." My heart squeezed in my chest. "We've always spent time together." "Yeah," he said, his voice quieter now. "But not like this." I didn't know how to respond to that. I didn't want to respond to that. Because if I did, I would have to acknowledge the truth that had been slowly unraveling between us for weeks. So instead I leaned my head back, closing my eyes. "I know what you mean." The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt heavier, charged with something neither of us wanted to name. After a long pause, Marcus spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve to be happy, Mom." I opened my eyes, turning to look at him. He was staring at me, his gaze unwavering, something fierce in his expression. I am happy, I said, though it didn't come out as confidently as I wanted it to. His lips pressed together. Not with him. I swallowed hard. Marcus. I see it, he continued, cutting me off. You smile around him, but it never reaches your eyes. You let him hold your hand, but you don't lean into it. You settle for him, but you don't want him. My breath hitched. I should have denied it. I should have told him he was wrong, that he didn't understand. But I couldn't. Because he was right. And suddenly I wasn't thinking about Simon anymore. I was thinking about the way Marcus looked at me now. The way he had been looking at me for weeks. I was thinking about the way my pulse quickened when his hands brushed against mine, the way I leaned in without thinking when he spoke, the way I felt when we were together. I was thinking about all the moments I had ignored, all the ways I had convinced myself that nothing was changing. But it was changing. And neither of us could pretend otherwise. He leaned in just slightly, his breath warm against my skin. I didn't move. I didn't pull away. Tell me I'm wrong, he murmured. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Because he wasn't wrong. And we both knew it.